Hello, everyone. I'm here with Kaia Alderson, author of Sisters in Arms. Kaia is a historical fiction and women's fiction author, and she is here with us to do a reading and questions and comments. Kaia, it's all you.
All right, thank you, Jade. First off, I want to thank you as well as the whole Willard Library system for inviting me. And I know originally I was supposed to be there in person, and life happens. So I'm glad that we do have this option to do this virtually. Um, to get started, as she said, my name is Kaia Alderson, and I write women's historical fiction. My passion is for Black women's history or African American women's history, specifically in early 20th century history. But there's other pockets of time that I'm also very interested about. Um, as we held up the book before, this is Sisters in Arms. And I don't know if you guys can see it anymore. I know when we first checked in, there was a picture in the background. And that picture is significant because it's basically what was the spark for the book. I'm going to hold it up here like this. And basically, what happened is about 10 years ago, this picture floated across my Twitter stream. And I've always been a bit of a history nerd and World War II and Black history, as I said. And I hadn't seen anything like that before. I knew there had been women that served within the Women's Army or during World War II, and I knew that Black people had served, but it was my first time seeing Black women in uniform. And I looked at the picture, I said, "Ooh, that's Europe, and that definitely looks like the 40s." So I very quickly went and typed in World War II, Black women, Europe, and very quickly was introduced to the unit known as affectionately as the 6888. The 6888 Postal Directory Battalion was the only all-Black and all-female military unit or WAC unit to go overseas during World War II. And they were tasked with sorting and distributing the mail that had backed up. Basically, they were there in 1945, February 1945 to March of 1946. And in the year prior to that, 1944, it was backed up primarily because you had D-Day, which was June 44. And then once you had that push onto the European continent into France and everywhere, the mail wasn't necessarily the priority. It was getting troops to where they needed to be, getting the supplies they needed, weapons, material, food, things like that. And then everybody said, oh, this war will be over by Christmas 1944. And as we know, Christmas 1944 came and went. And so morale started getting a little shaky because it's like, that that supposed deadline came and we're still here, we're still fighting. And so it became important to getting the mail to the troops. And if anybody's ever been in the military or even to college or even summer camp, mail call is the most important thing. It's your life link to home and what is normal. So I went and I learned about this fascinating unit, and I was like, "Oh my god, I have to write a story about this." And I basically immediately I said, "I want to do Soldier Girl's last night in town before she ships out," to do a twist on what we used to see a lot of in the movies and things like that. So I very quickly plotted out this beautiful little romance story. It was going to be a historical romance novella. I was going to self-publish it because I was like, that's probably not. This was before World War II was really big in literature and things. And so I was like, nobody's probably going to be that interested in it, but I really want to see this story exist, and I was going to do it for myself. So I was working on that, and maybe about a year or two later, my now editor posted the same picture on Twitter and said, "Somebody write me this book." And my friends were like, Kaia, she's talking about your unit. And so I went and I got in contact with her. I said, I'm actually working on a historical romance about it. I got about 100 pages. And long story short, we had a conversation and she said, well, send me whatever you have and we'll go from there. And then next thing you know, I had a book deal and then I got an agent. I did things a little backwards. And then year or two later, you have Sisters in Arms books in your hands. So that is the short story behind the book, excuse me, and how I became familiar with the 6888. In terms of why I would be interested or how I developed the characters and things like that, that actually started even further back than 8 or 9 years ago. It started with a homework assignment, a social studies assignment in middle school. Yay, social studies teachers. The assignment was to speak to the oldest person in your family and ask them what they did during World War II. And I wound up speaking to my Aunt Carmen. She was my grandmother's first cousin, and that particular grandmother, she died when I was very, very young. So she stepped in to act as a surrogate grandmother. And so she was telling me about her war experiences, and I was completely unprepared when she said, "Oh, I was a filing clerk for the Army in Manhattan." And I was just surprised because, normally when you hear about Black people in the past or even in the 1940s and 30s, it's usually some sad hard luck story, Jim Crow segregation, things like that, not getting a lot of opportunities. So I was just like, wow, did not realize, Black people were able to have those types of opportunities. To which she laughed and she said the only reason why she got that job was because her supervisor was amused by the fact that she was a colored girl with a college degree. And so that quote, that line came back to me as I was researching the 6888 because um, it was a self-contained unit. So all of the officers were Black females. And to be considered for officer training, you had to have at least some college. And so what I quickly realized is in that very first training class of officers, there were 40 Black women. So there was a whole bunch of colored girls with college degrees that were a part of the story of Black women in general in the United States Army during World War II, as well as the story of the 6888. So I was like, oh, okay. So when I was developing the character of Grace, this very spark nugget of Grace was based on Aunt Carmen and how it was like her superhero origin story for me because obviously I knew her later towards the end of her life, the last 20 some odd years of her life. And by then she was a spark plug. She said what she thought. Um, she loved hard and she corrected you hard. And she was the type of person, she even on her deathbed, she was telling people exactly what she thought and was like, if you did wrong by me, you'll see me in the afterlife, things like that. And at her funeral, they even played "I Did It My Way" by Frank Sinatra as the entrance processional, to which everybody would just chuckle and be like, "Yeah, that's right, that's Aunt Carmen." So I always wondered, who was this Aunt Carmen in the 40s when she was a younger woman in her 20s. And so I just kind of went from there. Um, Grace in the book is not Aunt Carmen, if any family members are out there. It's just, the beginning of the idea. In terms of Eliza, the second main character in the book, she was a little bit of me in that when I was her age, 23 years old, I looked about 12. And so coming out of college, getting my first job in corporate America, things like that, having positions of authority, it was kind of an adjustment for me as well as for others to take me seriously because it was like, you're a child. I'm like, no, I'm actually 20 something years old. So I thought it would be interesting to have somebody who looked young for their age as a Black woman in the 1940s in a position of authority, giving orders to people and expecting to be followed and taken seriously. And I also remembered a movie from the early 1980s starring Goldie Hawn called Private Benjamin. And the basic plot of that is she was a rich woman from New York who was unexpectedly widowed at a young age. And so what she did, when there was that unexpected pivot in her life, she joined the army. And so now you have this rich, pampered woman now thrown into a barracks with a bunch of strangers and being told what to do. And so I thought that would be interesting to show that experience from the Black female lens in the 1940s. So obviously these two type of personalities are definitely going to clash. And so that's why, I'm basically through these two women, very distinct personalities in a room together, having to live together, figuring it out, all while learning how to go from civilian life to army life, as well as the regular things that limitations we know that a Black woman would have experienced in the 1940s, and being in certain parts of the country, and not in the safe little haven that they had, originating from Harlem in New York. which is an all black situation. So that is how I came up with those characters. Let's see what else. In terms of the experiences they would have had, or in terms of when I in trying to write the story, obviously I plotted it out first, and once the book deal happened, and it was not just my little passion project, but it was like, going to be a real thing that was going to be in the bookstore. I realized, "Ooh, I get to go and do some real deep research." I had initially ordered the books. The commanding officer of the 6 888, Major Charity Adams Early, had written her memoir, so I'd gotten that. A couple academics had written about the unit, and I had looked that up. But I actually got to travel. I went to Baltimore to the premiere of the documentary, The 6 888, about the unit, which I'm glad I did, because in seeing the interviews with the veterans, I had forgotten how spunky the women from that generation were. So, that helped me to make sure that I put a little bit of that spunk and that fire in those characters. And I also got to go to Iowa, to Des Moines, where they trained, which was Fort Des Moines, and they have a museum there. So it was closed even before COVID when we went, and so we had to get special permission to go see the exhibit. But we basically had the whole museum to ourselves. A friend of mine went with me, so we were able to, excuse me, they had a whole display there. Half the museum was about the Women's Army Corps, because that was a training center for them during World War II. So we were able to see like all the uniforms, everything that would have been issued to them, their training schedules, the typewriters that they were had out on display. You could actually get a feel for how that was different from our modern day keyboards. We were able to go look in the archives and documents, and happened to come across one of their menus for the mess hall. So I was able to incorporate that and get a feel for what they were eating in the Army in the 40s. What else? We were able to see uniforms up close. So there is a difference between like the summer uniform versus the winter uniform, and how warm you thought that they might be, given that the 6 888 would have been in England in February, which was very cold. So if they didn't have the right equipment for whatever reason, that would have been a very distinct experience. Um, what else did we see? What a big surprise for me, though, when I went to Fort Des Moines, is one half of the museum is for the Women's Army Corps, and the other half is for the Black men who served in World War One. During World War One, Fort Des Moines is where the Black officers from the Medical Corps trained, and that was completely unknown to me. For World War One, I had known about the Harlem Hellfighters, which came out of they were part of the New York Armory. And they were attached to the French army during World War One, and that's the unit that had introduced jazz to Europe. But I had not known, that there were officers in the medical corps who were Black men. So that was exciting. I was even able to see what their training schedules were like, and what that life experience was like. The other place I got to go and travel to was New York in the summer of 2019. So by then I had pretty much had the first draft done, so I knew the places that people that were going, the set pieces that were going to be in the book. So obviously I went to Harlem. I'd grown up in the Northeast in New Jersey, so I've been to Harlem before, but I hadn't been in a long time, so it was good just to acquaint myself with the energy of Harlem, and walking the streets of Harlem, and what everyday sounds would have been like, even if it was 70 years after the fact. Or if you've ever been to Harlem, the energy there is just a little different. I knew that Grace would be traveling on the train from uptown down to downtown Lower Manhattan, to where the recruitment center actually was. It was right there next to the Battery, so I was able to go there. I knew what it was like walking up the steps. Had a feel for what it was like to walk from that train station. It wasn't the same train station that was there in the 40s, but it was basically about the same. And go to the building that was still there. Looked a little different, had a little bit different functioning, but I walked around just to get a feel, and kind of use my writer's mind of what that area would have been like in the 40s, now that I knew what the street layout was, what was still remaining from that time, and what was kind of new and modern. So there is a scene where, when they're at the recruitment center, and Grace and Eliza are talking, and it's been raining outside, and Eliza says, "Oh, I took a cab here," and Grace is like, "Why would you do that? It's not even a block." You know, if you're familiar with the area, you know that would be true. I was also able to go up about 45 minutes north of Manhattan to Orange County, New York, which is where Camp Shanks was located. And Camp Shanks was the port of embarkation. So basically, everybody who from the American side who participated in the war in Europe had to go through Camp Shanks. They shipped out of there. When I went, it was the 75th anniversary of D-Day, and so they had a large exhibit there at the Historical Society because 75% of everyone who had participated in D-Day had gone through Camp Shanks, which was awesome because the historian there had original copies of the Camp Shanks base newspaper. And so when I made the arrangements to come, she went and got the dates that the 6 888 would have passed through, which was the last week in January, first week of February 1945. So she pulled all of the newspapers and paraphernalia she had 2 weeks prior to when they would have been there and 2 weeks after. So I was able to see the pie shop had just opened up on site, and that was a big deal in terms of what the bus schedules were, the train schedules were. Because at one point I was writing it thinking, oh, she would have missed the last bus or the last train back to base while she was in having her last night in Manhattan, and that wasn't true. It was a 24-hour cycle of buses and trains because they knew that as troops were, it was a constant fluid situation where troops were going in and out, having their leave, having their last nights in New York, things like that. So I was able to make that, adapt that to the story so that it was accurate. We knew what we were able to see, the entertainment that was coming through, the celebrities. I saw an article just prior to their arriving at Camp Shanks where in Harlem, an officers club had just opened at the Hotel Teresa. It was, and obviously I went there after I walked around Harlem. So I was like, oh, I would have walked over to the Hotel Teresa if I had known. So I was able to get that kind of detail. So that helped to infuse that, that the the last night in New York City before shipping out experience that, I originally intended when I first conceived the book was in there. I did not get a chance to go to England or France. It just didn't work. And then once the pandemic hit, obviously I couldn't go over there. And so I just kind of, I told people, and I kind of just put it out in the universe or the energy in my mind. It would be great if I could find an African American woman who has lived in England and has been to Birmingham where they were stationed, and is as big of a World War II geek as I am, to make sure I get that part of the story right. And in my head, I was like, in the off chance that anybody from England ever reads this book, I would just like them to, at least make sure I got it right and not yank them out of the story. Unbeknownst to me, later on, the subsidiary rights sold to the UK, so the book is actually on the shelves in the United Kingdom right now. So a lot of British people are reading the book, and I got those details right. But she was able to. I did find that person. On a fluke or a lark, and she's an even bigger World War II geek than I am. And when we first met, that just talking and introducing ourselves and sharing facts and figures and resources, but she was invaluable help. She was able to say, I've been in the type of buildings you're talking about, and this is what they feel. I've spent overnight in these types of buildings, so yes, there wouldn't have been air conditioning or central heat, and it would have been very drafty. And I had come across an off fact about how excuse me, at least at the time, Americans in general were a little bit taller than a typical British bed. So there's a little fact in there that one of my characters was tall, and that when she laid down on the bed, it was a little bit shorter than she was used to. Her feet were hanging off and having to adjust. She was looking up, she was even familiar with like when the sun would have set and when the when sunrise would have been. So in terms, there's a couple scenes where I'm dealing with when at nighttime or dusk or dawn, and so we were able to get that. In terms of slang that would have been used at the time, she caught my errors, so we were able to get that corrected. And then she even knew a little bit about France as well, and so she was able to give me some tips and feedbacks on that as well. And she'd been a history major, and her focus was on Germany and World War II. So she was even able to help give me some feedback on the German characters that I have towards the end of the book. So that was the research experience. It was awesome. I tried, I had hoped to go to the Schomburg, if you're familiar with it. That's the branch of the New York Public Library that's dedicated to the history of African American history. Um, they didn't necessarily have anything, but again, it was a building in a neighborhood that was there during my time period where these people would have interacted. So I was able to just, kind of soak up the vibe there as well. So that is my general story in terms of how I came up with the book, how the people who influenced me, things that I'm into. I'm definitely, as soon as I'm able to, I definitely do want to go to England and see if how close to correct I got with my own facts. And when I went off in my imagination, I know that the school where the 688 was stationed is still there and is actually operational. Recently, they put a plaque up commemorating the fact that they were there and the work that they did there during the war. So that's one of my goals, to get over there, to get to Birmingham and see, walk the roads that they walk, things like that, just like I was able to do in Iowa and in New York. And if anybody has any questions for me, feel free to post them in the chat. I'd be more than happy to. You don't have to wait until I stop speaking. Um, so that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Let's see, what else can we talk about? One thing that I really love is how they did the cover on this book. If you can see it, it was how that started is we were able to ask for that I have be able to give feedback when they were designing it. So I was able to go through I went through like a lot of other historical fiction covers and things like that, and pick out elements that I liked. I knew that I wanted to have their faces. I know there's a trend right now where the woman is had her back turned, and I said, if at all possible, let's show their faces, because again, if it's news to me or it was a new experience for me to see Black women in uniform from that time period, it's going to be like that for a bunch of other people. And then one cool thing that they're able to do is get the postal themes in there. So I thought that was really cool. And this was actually when they did gave me a sample cover. That was the very first one they gave me. I think there's only very minor changes that, only the most geeky of geeks and people would notice. So there's that. Another thing I was able to do within the book is there's actually a lot of cameos in the book. And towards the end of the process of getting everything fact checked, I had to come up with a list and say, okay, this character was real, this wasn't. And I think it was like a page. My list was a page long of all the real people that are in the book. There's some obvious ones like Mary McLeod Bethune, General Benjamin O. Davis is in there. Eleanor Roosevelt has a very, very brief cameo, but there's also some that aren't as obvious. Some people have picked up on and some people haven't. I know there's one in there that no one has said that they've picked up on yet, and so I'm not going to tell you. But if you're a jazz history, I'm a jazz person and you're into jazz and bebop and you're really geeky about that period of time and you just happen to know, I try to keep it true to life. If a person was in a location in real life and and it worked well with the story, I would put them in there. So if you know your jazz history and you know where certain people were in 1945 in New York and things like that, then you may pick up on that one. But Earl Hines, Father Earl Hines, he was a jazz pianist from the bebop era. He has a scene in the he has two scenes actually in the book. Who else is in there? Thurgood Marshall and his first wife make a very brief appearance in there. Um, in terms of the female soldiers in the book, if I've mentioned them by name, it was the name of somebody who was either in that first training class or who was part of the 688. I have a list of both, just to give, if any of their relatives are reading, I just want to, at least say, there's grandma. She was there. She was doing these things. Some people I've mentioned by first and last name when it's necessary. Some people are just by first name, but it's basically true to life. And everything in the book, even though the main characters are fictional or fiction characters, I made them up. Everything that happened to them happened to somebody. It may not, chronologically or things like that. So if I know there's elements of the book that may seem so to be too good to be true, or it just so happened to work out, or things like that. But it really did happen. The scene on the train where the military police are called, that happened to Major Charity Adams. Um, excuse me, things that happened in Europe, tragedies and things that actually happened. I wasn't in terms of tragedies in Europe, I wasn't able to get all of the exact details, so I did embellish a bit. But in terms of the names of the people that were involved, and the dates and things like that, that actually happened. Um, what else? In terms of training camp, from the details I was able to get, because I did read multiple sources, I kind of cobbled that together, not just from the women who were in that particular training class, but also the letters for of or diaries of other women who were white women, other backgrounds and things, just to get a sense for it. Now, I do see a question about plans for a sequel. Now, when I wrote the book, I did not have a plan for a sequel. I kind of, the way I left it open ended, and I won't go into the details of that, on purpose, so that whatever you think that they should do, or decisions that they hadn't made but could possibly make, you can go let your minds run free with that. But it seems like every time I do a talk, everyone's like, when's the sequel? What about this person or this situation? And so I have started thinking about it. I have the skeleton of an idea of a story, but I would have to do a lot of research, and I haven't done that yet. And there's some other time periods or stories that I want to play with first. And so, like, it takes me a while, because even with my next book, that one I started researching maybe about 2, 3 years ago, and it's been sitting and simmering in my head, and only now am I getting to write it. So it's possible. I did talk to my editor about my general ideas, and she seemed to like them. So we'll see. And I won't say anything more about that, because if there's anybody who hasn't read the book or finished it, I don't want to spoil. But if you have read the book and you know about a little something that happens toward the end, it'll probably have something to do with that. So, does anybody have any more questions for me? I can talk about all kinds of things. I'm trying to say, what other things do people find interesting about this book? Oh, a lot of people ask me if I spoke to any veterans while I was working on the story, and I actually didn't. The closest I got to speaking to any veterans was I met Major Adams' son, and it was a very brief conversation, to the point of, "Hi, I'm writing a book about the unit, a novel about the unit." And he was like, "Okay, great." And did have his email, but when I came home, I was sick and things, so I misplaced it and I didn't get in contact with him. But even though a lot of people, more recently, there's a lot of talk about the 6 AAA, but even prior to that, there there's about out of the 855 women who served, about 6 of them are still alive, and they're very active and very spunky. And if you do a Google search, they're still around to tell their story, and I wanted them to tell their stories. Like I said, Major Adams wrote her memoir. Dovey Johnson Roundtree, who was in that initial class in 1942. She was not a part of 6 AAA, but she was an officer. She has her memoir out called A Mighty Justice, and she tells her story. The text is out there, the interviews are out there. So if you want to hear their direct experiences, you can find that. There were themes and things that Black women in general were going through in the 1940s that I wanted to talk about and play with, and nobody's story lined up to that. So I needed the flexibility of fictional characters. So I wanted to talk about, like, you know, you can't when you're because these the Black female officer specifically, it was a very lonely experience depending on where you're stationed, if there were no other Black male units nearby, because you can't fraternize with the enlisted people or anybody who's under your rank. It's only somebody who's at your same level in terms of interacting socially, dating, things like that. So I kind of wanted to play with that. And it took me a while to figure out, at least in Grace's case, why was there an able-bodied man not in uniform and able to move around like he did. And it took me a while to be able to figure out, to justify that or figure it out. And luckily, I stumbled across the memoirs of Truman Gibson Jr., real life person, very interesting person. If you get a chance to look for his memoir, during the war, he was an assistant aide to the Secretary of War. So excuse me. So it was his job to go around the country and even overseas and check on this the status of Black troops anywhere in the military. So if there was a problem, he could address it, come up with a solution to present to the Secretary of War. There was in one case where there were a bunch of enlisted men who were in the Midwest, and the boxer Joe Louis, he was in the Army at the time, and he would go on these promotional tours and things like that. And he came across these guys, and they were college educated, they were eligible for officers training, and for whatever reason, be it racism, bureaucracy, whatever, they weren't being considered. And so Joe Louis was able to go back to Truman Gibson Jr. and say, hey, there's a situation with these guys. And so Truman Gibson was able to, Mr. Gibson was able to step in and say, hey, make whoever needed to know these guys are eligible and they should be trained. And that particular story is significant because one of those guys who became an officer, somebody you might have heard of called Jack Robinson, who's more familiar, we know him as Jackie Robinson, the man who integrated Major League Baseball in 1947. Another interesting thing that Truman Gibson did was before the war, he was a lawyer in Chicago, and what made him come to prominence nationally is he was the lawyer for Lorraine Hansberry's family in Chicago when they moved into a white neighborhood. They came into some money. If you know the play A Raisin in the Sun, which Lorraine Hansberry wrote, it's actually based on her family's experiences, where in the 30s, they were the first Black family to move into this white neighborhood, and a lawsuit came up because of the covenants and things like that, where the white neighbors were trying to get them to prevent them from moving in and then trying to force them out. And Truman Gibson Jr. was the lead attorney on that case. So that was a surprise for me while I was reading his memoir. I'm like, oh, okay, it's all connected somehow. He was also a boxing promoter and a talent agent and things like that. So I was able to incorporate bits and pieces of his story into my character story within the book. What other fun things was I able to, come up with? I was able to work in, as I said before, Thurgood Marshall. Before he was a Supreme Court justice, he was an attorney for the NAACP legal aid or defense fund. And so he was stationed out of Harlem. And he was interacting within the circles with these families, and so I made him a neighbor to Eliza's family, or a colleague, and so they were able to have dinner together. And what was interesting is while I was researching this book and digging, I just part of my historical geekery, as I call it, is I'll just go and Google random things, or go to look up archives online and just see what they have in their collection and see if it spurs any ideas. And somehow on one day I came across Black firefighters in New York City, and I had always known or been told my grandfather was one of the first Black firefighters in New York City, and he was one of the co-founders of the Vulcan Society, which was the fraternal society for Black firefighters in New York City. And so somehow I fell down the rabbit hole of New York City Black firefighters, and I was able to find out that my grandfather, he was one of the first ones. He wasn't the first. They were kind of hired in batches over time. So he was like number somewhere between the 20th Black one and the 30th Black one, somewhere in there. I still need to do more digging. But I also found out not only was he a co-founder of the Vulcan Society, he was also the president of it in the 1940s. And they were actually very active in the labor movement. So as president of the organization, he was interacting with Thurgood Marshall in the 40s as an NAACP attorney. He was interacting with A. Philip Randolph, who organized the Pullman porters, and in 1944 had threatened to have a march on Washington to get more jobs for Black people in defense industries. Come to find out, when the march on Washington, that happened in 44, it happened in 63. The Vulcan Society were the fire marshals for that event. So I was like, oh wait. At that point, my grandfather was retired from the department, but I was like, oh wait, my grandfather was interacting with these people. And his brother, his last living brother, who was still alive at the time when I found this out, didn't know anything about it. He was a little bit younger than my grandfather. My dad, who, he told me the basics of, he was one of the first Black firefighters, and the Vulcan Society founder, knew nothing about it. And he's like, my dad never talked about this. And it was just interesting, and I was like, just in the doing fact checking little things for this book, I find out this whole personal family history of, oh, okay, my grandfather was a labor rabble rouser, and he was like buddy with some of these people. Like, then I went back into old pictures that I have of my grandparents, and I found one picture, and it looks a lot like A. Philip Randolph in his later years, and the fashion. A. Philip Randolph died in the late 70s, and the fashion was about early 70s. And I need to go to Chicago, um, and to the Pullman Porters Museum is there, just to see if maybe, is this a picture of my grandparents with having lunch with A. Philip Randolph? So it was really interesting in just knowing my own family history, and studying this story in the places that they were in. I was able to pull them up in random places. Another time that happened is, again, just going through old papers or whatever, I found out that my great grandmother had owned property in upstate New York near where Camp Shanks was. Didn't think anything about it. I was just like, oh, I didn't realize my family had owned. I knew the property from when my grandmother lived there, but I didn't know that it went back that far. And so when I was talking to the historian about the 6888 and what conditions would have been like there as a Black woman, being stationed in temporary housing, because remember, they were segregated by race. They were also segregated by gender. And so, since they were the only ones that ever went overseas, what type of housing arrangements would they have had? They would have had to like find a barracks just for them. And the historian there, she said, well, the officers would have lived with families, Black families in the area in Nyack. And I was like, oh, my grandmother, my great grandmother had a house there. And so, not to say that I don't know for a fact if the officers actually did stay with my family members back then, but from what I know of my family, and they were very civic minded and social justice oriented. It was if the opportunity had been presented to them, it's something they would have done. So, when I talk about who they're staying with in the book, I kind of alluded to my family there, and it was kind of fun, because when my family members read the book, they're like, is that are you talking about, it's just like little things peppered in, Easter eggs, again, on a different layer. So there's Easter eggs for my family members. There's Easter eggs for people who are just music, people who are into music history, or who are into New York history or Harlem history things. So I thought it was a lot of fun to do that in the book. I even have, not necessarily a hidden thing or Easter egg, but I even have a nurse in Europe who is passing, a Black woman who is a nurse passing as white to be able to serve, because they had the Army Nurse Corps. And there was actually a shortage of nurses back then, and they were desperate, but they would not let Black women into the Army Nurse Corps. They only, I think, there's several thousand people that served in the Nurse Corps, and they only let about 240 Black women in total over the course of the war. And my grandmother was a nurse, and she would have been about the right age during the war. She did not serve overseas. She was in New York. And she was actually fair enough where she could have passed for white. So it was kind of just like a little gentle nod to her, that I put that character in there. And a couple of people said, wait, was this character passing? And I was like, yep, she was, just to put that little thing in. So, actually, my that grandmother's best friend is still with us. She's 107 years old, and she read the book. And so I was a little nervous, just, just to have somebody who was actually of that age, that same age during that same time period. And she said she loved the book, and she said it rang true to her. So I was like, okay, other people can say what they want, but somebody from the greatest generation said it was okay. So I guess I did all right. So do we have any other questions? You're muted.
Sorry, I have one.
Oh,
I
okay.
switched locations because I was having technical difficulties, but
Mhm.
um, you actually answered like almost everything on my
Awesome.
list. So the one that I have remaining is: was this the hardest genre for you to write in because of all the research and time that it took, or once you had all that research, it just flowed?
It the history part was actually easy for me because it's just what I'm into. You definitely, if you don't love history, you don't want to do it because this was so many little details and things. But for me, it was always like me fact checking everything. Even the book I am now, like this draft is just nothing. Every other line, fact check this, fact check that, and just to know what you need to fact check. The hardest thing for me was before this book, the longest thing I'd ever written was 28,000 words, novellas. And this was a whole novel. The final version is like 104,000 novels. So I had to learn how to write a novel very quickly, and I always use the, analogy, I was used to sprinting, and this was a whole marathon, and it's completely different strategy and things like that. If you're into running and things like that, then you might be able to understand it. So it's just a whole that was the hardest thing for me is like, "Okay, I think I told my whole story, and I still need 20,000 words. What you know, how do I do that?" Or I wrote myself into a corner, or how much detail is too much detail, when to pull back. So I actually wound up reading a lot of historical fiction um, with the writers. I come from a romance writing background, and so I was able to see, oh, okay, we're able to kind of sit in the scene and not just race through where with romance novels or shorter novels you get about 50 to 60,000 words, and so you kind of have to get in there and just say I feel this way, and oh that's great or that's not so great, but keep moving. And I was able to just kind of sit in that feeling, and you know again it was like a whole thing where you just have to go in my mind. I had to like put myself in those characters' heads and then kind of like just create in my mind, okay, I'm in the 1940s now. So I'm not watching TV, I'm listening to the radio. I'm listening to the soap operas on the radio. I remembered the one little fact my grandfather told me about the war where with the butter, they you had butter was rationed, so you had margarine. It was this white goo stuff that would have a little yellow pellet, and you had to break that open. And he
Yeah,
was
that
like,
was interesting to read about. I was like trying to visualize it. I was like,
yeah.
different.
Yeah, because, they didn't have necessarily plastic bags or things like that. They would have, like, wax paper, and you're sitting there massaging, breaking the little pellet and then massaging the color into it so you could pretend it was butter. So, it's little things like that. Oh, I forgot. Just so happened near me, I'm on the coast of Georgia, on St. Simon's Island, they opened up a World War II home front museum. So it was all about the home front experience. So they part of the exhibit is they have this little thing where they give you your ration stamps, and you go to the grocery store and you figure out what you can buy and how much of it you can buy for the week. So I was able to go there and play around with that and kind of get a sense of that, because even if you're in the military, you had to have a ration book. So you turned in your ration book when you enlisted, and then if you had to go somewhere and be out and about, they would give you one so you could give what you needed to the restaurants. So it's even little things like that, but just understanding I had the room and space to play with these little details and put them in and how to balance it out. That was probably, you know, just doing that, talking more, without dragging on and spending 30 pages about, "This is what it felt like to ride the train from one end of Manhattan to the other."
Speaking of the details,
Mhm,
could you talk more about the scene where in Birmingham in the ladies' apartment
mhm.
where they mentioned tales after midnight?
Okay. That is
Oh,
based
I
on a
forgot.
that happened. Um, the way that story came about, in Major Adams' memoir, it's called One Woman's Army. She said at one point people who were on leave were coming back late and later than they were supposed to, and it just didn't make any sense. And when she went around asking, what happened, excuse me, they're like, they kept, she would ask the women, and they're like, they just kept talking to us and wouldn't let us leave. And so finally they had to figure out, oh, the white GIs told them, the white male soldiers from the U.S. would tell these people when they heard these black women were coming, oh yeah, they grow tails after midnight. And so there weren't as many. There are always people of color in England, we know that, but it wasn't what we're thinking, where you have like all the people from the African countries and from the Caribbean. That was more after the war and part of their recovery. So it was like, just to see this many black women, they didn't know. And so it was just, okay, is it true? Who knows? So they would very politely try to have people stay past midnight to see if, the tails would come out and things like that. And they had to be like, no, we're normal, just like you. And, once they realized, they didn't from the sense I got from the way they wrote about it, and they might have sanitized it or not, it wasn't malicious like you would think, where if they said black people had tails here in the United States back then, where it was a lot more malicious. I think it was a general curiosity, and so I try to write it that way, where the villain in this was those GIs who told them something that wasn't true. But yes, that did happen, where they thought that for a hot second.
And you mentioned when my computer went haywire that you don't really hear a lot of if anything, you don't hear about women in World War II, African American women in World War II. And to the best of my knowledge, or what I have seen, I've not seen movie adaptations depicting these women, and only these women, like as main characters and not side characters. So if Sisters in Arms was made into a movie, who would you cast as your Eliza and your characters and Grace?
I would love it, or in my head, I was thinking Keke Palmer as Grace, and then Kyla Pratt as Eliza. But I keep seeing, as I'm watching a lot more TV because I don't have, just in terms I'm home more because of the pandemic. And so I'm seeing other actresses, but that's who I had in my head in the latter parts of the revisions or writing the book. A lot of Grace's nervous tics, like tapping and on her leg and piano playing, I actually got from Kiki's performance in Aquila and the Bee, when she was trying to remember the letters and things like that. So it was like those little things that she was doing always kind of stuck to me, and that's why I see her in it. In terms for the male characters, it really changes because there's so many actors out there who could do a Jonathan or a Noah. John Boyega could do it. I could see Winston Duke. I can see Aldous Hodge would be really good, I think, for Noah, even though he's already played a Noah in another show. He could even be Jonathan, because I could see him in that 1940s cut of a suit. So I'm hopefully, I know some people have asked, but nothing has happened. Hopefully that will happen, and I would love to see what that looks like. In terms of portraying Black women in World War II fiction, the only time I've seen it is if you've seen Band of Brothers, the HBO series. In the episode about the Battle of Bastogne, I think it's in France or Belgium. Please forgive me, I mix up my facts at this point. But they show the Angels of Bastogne, which was there was a Belgian nurse. Yeah, this was in Belgium. Thank you. There was a nurse that they centered on, but if you're paying attention, there was also a light-skinned Black woman who was helping her. And the white nurse was killed in a bombing. The Black woman lived, and I think she died in the 2000s, something like that. But they were both, to those men there, they were both considered the angels of Bastogne. But as you go through history, what got down was the angel singular who was killed. A lot of that, the reason why we're not seeing it, or we're just hearing about these stories, was the way the media worked back then is in the mainstream mediums, the big newspapers, that national newspapers, you really didn't see Black people mentioned unless something was wrong. Somebody got caught stealing or murders and things like that. The Black press talked about them often. You would see the announcements, so-and-so's daughter joined the army and received this rank and things like that in the Black press. you would they would highlight our achievements and things that we did. The white press, not so much. And then once they were in the army and given the opportunities, they used the different bases, and the commanders there would use the excuse, I don't have the resources to segregate by race and by gender, so I'll take the white wax, but the black wax I don't need. So there was a point in time where you had more black wax just sitting and drilling and not twiddling their thumbs, but you know practicing and doing what you do in boot camp in your downtime, waiting to be assigned and not necessarily being assigned. Or you would get assigned the worst jobs. You're like, I'm going to join the army so I don't have to be a maid, and you wind up in the army scrubbing bedpans and things like that, working in hospitals and being an orderly. In the 6888 documentary, the veterans talk about they wouldn't let you do, they didn't want to see you achieve, and they wouldn't let you they would purposely put you in situations where you weren't able to distinguish yourself, to have something to be proud about. And you see that in the statistics. If you look at in terms of the casualties in World War II, on the US side, overwhelmingly all the people who were killed were white men. Comparatively very few black men were killed because they dragged their feet on letting black male soldiers serve in combat. And I always thought it was interesting. He was like, so you were willing to let your own son be put on the front line to have his, at the risk of death, to have his moment of glory, and not, so many black people, you could say, survive because they wouldn't let us put us in a combat. And the veterans said they wouldn't let us do anything to distinguish ourselves. And you'll hear people, as we talk about the 6888, oh, all they did was sort the mail. But like I said before, if you've ever been in that situation where you're far away from home, you're in the military, you're away at school, you're at camp, that lifeline is what keeps you going sometimes, just to know, get that letter from home, that encouraging word. The motto of the 6888 was no mail, low, no morale. And so that was their battle charge to help. This is what they did was important, to help in those last few months or weeks of the war, to get morale up so that they could do those final pushes to beat the Axis. They weren't the first ones given the task. The people who were already there, they gave the guys to try the task of trying to figure out this backlog of mail. And they couldn't figure it out. They got some women who were over there, and they couldn't figure it out. So they said, we'll give this impossible task to the black women. We're only going to give you 6 months to figure out. It was 6 airplane hangars, those semicircle ones, top to bottom, front to back, full of mail, rotting packages, improperly addressed, things like that. We're going to give you 6 months to get this, figure out this mess. And they did it in 3. They didn't necessarily have postal training before they came over, because of security. They didn't know what they were doing until they got there and saw this big pile of this big mess of that the mail had become. We didn't have computers back then, the internet filing system. So, for the several million personnel, soldiers, Red Cross workers, everybody had basically their own index card. And every time they moved somewhere, they would get the updates and have to write down, cross it out, write down where they were next, or last known location. If they were injured and were in a hospital somewhere, you had to write that down on the card. If they were deceased, and they would do that. You had, and I talk about it in the book, you would have Johnny in the army, or just the unit, and not have the last name. If there's 15,000 Robert Smiths and you just write Bobby or Bobby Smith without the serial number, they had to figure that out. So it wasn't they just sorted the mail. They didn't have all the they showed up and they just said, here's this pile of stuff, figure it out. They had to create the system and had to get it going and things like that. So it was really a big deal. Just sorting the mail was really a little bit more and more technical than what people try to not give them credit for.
Yeah, that scene when they were talking about like the rats coming out of the packages of presents that had been sent there and just like sat.
Mhm.
I was like,
Yeah,
that
his
sounds
granny sent a
pretty bad.
fruitcake to John Boy for Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
And,
They didn't know where to send it.
It got there in January, and now it's the middle of February, end of March, early March, and yeah.
Mhm. And I have one more question for you.
Mhm.
Do you have a musical background at all? Because there's a lot of
A lot of
music in
music.
there, and I was noticing it. So.
Mhm. I that's another one of my geeks. I know the history of American popular music really well, to the point where one semester in college, for my fine arts credit, I took the history of African American music, and then for like my social studies or sociology history credit, I took the history of jazz in the same semester. So one summer I read Rolling Stone's History of Rock and Roll, which was 1,000 pages, and this was in '87. So I know a little bit about it. There's songs that I know the lyrics to, and I can tell you the whole story about it and had never heard. I went through a period of where I listened to a lot of oldies music just to be like, oh, that's what, okay, that's what that song sounds like. But I know nothing about classical music. So when I'm working on the story and I'm getting to know Grace and I'm like, okay, what's your motivation? What, outside of the war and all these other interesting things, what do you want to do? And she's like, I'm a classical pianist. And I was like, oh no, I know nothing about this. Luckily, someone had written the history of Juilliard, and I read half that book to basically get that first scene right, or just to get, the ticks, the personalities, traits, and things like that, which was really interesting. Again, I don't know anything. I couldn't tell you the songs that I was reading about, their or how technical they were, the difficulties, unless they said it. If they harped on one particular thing, I'd go and look it up and be like, oh, okay, that's what they're talking about. But yeah, my husband, he seems to be amused, but whenever we go on long car trips and we're listening to whatever oldie station, because like when it's the full family and my mother-in-law and everybody, we listen to Motown, oldies, 70s and stuff. And basically the whole time is like, oh, this song, let me tell you the story of this song and what's happening and how he wrote it and the drama or whatever. And he's like, really, every song? I'm like, yeah, deal with it.
When you learn it, you want to express it. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that is all I have for you. Does
Okay.
anyone else out there have any questions? I will
Like,
wait
why you
a
have
little bit.
me?
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, I can do a deep dive on the music. I could do a deep dive on the history. You know what? We can talk about my next book.
Okay. I'm going to get my pen and paper.
Okay, the book that I'm working on right now, the working title is called In a League of Her Own. It's my Negro Leagues baseball book, and it is about the only woman who is currently enshrined in the Baseball Hall of Fame. Her name is Effa Manley, and she co-owned a Negro Leagues team, the Newark Eagles in New Jersey, and she acted as what we would consider a general manager in today's terms. And this was in the 1930s and 40s.
Mm-hmm.
No one can say definitively if she was a woman of color or a black woman who was light skinned and could pass, but she openly lived her whole life as a black woman. She you can't so no one knows if she was a white woman who lived black because she chose to, or if she was mixed race or things like that. That's part of her story. The woman's story from her conception to her death is like a soap opera, and it's so fascinating. Even before she got involved with baseball, she was part of the civil rights movement in Harlem. In the 30s, at a certain point, you could do all the shopping you wanted on 125th Street, but you could not get a job on the sales floor. She helped to work towards integrating the workforce that way. Um, yeah, she's a trip, and she spoke her mind. For those who aren't familiar with that particular history, when they signed Jackie Robinson, they did not compensate the Kansas City Monarchs. There's a dispute whether or not he had a contract, and the Brooklyn Dodgers didn't acknowledge it or just ignored it and never compensated it. And they were pulling the top talent from the Negro Leagues, and the owners and the structure that was there that helped to nurture this talent wasn't being compensated. Effa Manley was the first Negro League owner to be compensated for her player when he went to the Major League Baseball, and she basically forced it for them to respect her as on equal footing as a business partner. So I get to tell her story.
Wow. Is there an expected release date for it? Because we'd love to have you back in person when it's warmer. So
I would love to come. I think right now it's tentatively spring of 23. It's
Okay.
due in a couple. The first draft is due in a couple weeks, so we'll see. I especially want to would love to do this in Michigan with you guys because there were actually several female owners in the Negro Leagues, and the one who's still
Mhm.
living, as far as I know, she's in Grand Rapids. And I
Oh,
haven't found anybody to connect me with her just to talk about it. She owned the Detroit Stars in the 50s. She actually also played. Minnie Forbes is her name. So if anybody out there knows her and she's willing to talk to me, just, what
are
was it
you
like to be
watching
an owner?
now?
Hi. I would love to talk to you on the phone. I don't have to be there in person.
Well, thank you so much. And we have a comment from Judith Williamson.
Mhm.
It's
You're
very
welcome.
interesting. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for, I know we wanted in person, but
Mhm,
thank you for the virtual visit anyway. So,
mhm.
all right.
All right, and I look forward to getting to Battle Creek sooner rather than later.
Sooner. Mm-hmm. When the snow
Definitely.
melts, you know.
Mhm.
Yeah. All right. Thanks,
Okay.
everyone.
All right,
I'd
thank
like
you,
to
everybody.
plug in. Don't forget to read our Battle Creek Reads, the Book of Harlan, which is also a World War II historical fiction, and on women in the music movement in World War II era. We have Women in Jazz that's happening March 9th at 7. So register for that, and you'll have a historical and musical experience.
It's gonna be awesome.
Thank you, Kaia.
Thank you. You guys have a great night.